Each consecutive speaker in order?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with Drew, who many of you I think probably know by now. Drew Robert Winter is an award-winning activist, writer, and scholar. In 2009, he was named one of the top 20 animal rights activists under 30 by Veg News magazine. Formerly director of publications at the Institute for Critical Animal Studies and member of the publishing collective Arisa Media Group, Drew Winter is now a PhD student in anthropology at Rice University, and he's studying activism in Denmark. His political writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine website, the Lansing State Journal, and Free Press Houston. He's also the co-author of Education for Action, Strategies to Ignite Social Justice, which is forthcoming from the New Society Press. His discussion today is based on research for his second book chapter to appear in No Bosses, No Masters, Anarchist Perspectives on Animal Liberation, forthcoming from McFarland Books. So please join me in welcoming Drew.
Thank you. Okay. So you'll have to all excuse me, I'm not a morning person, so if I'm not terribly sharp, I apologize. And if there's anything that you feel like I don't give a sufficient explanation for during the talk, feel free to catch me in a couple hours when I've had the caffeine totally hit me. So what I want to talk about today is Food Not Bombs as a way to kind of re-examine some of the strategies that we use and re-examining some of the kind of work that different strategies that we use for activism do in order to think more about ways that we can maybe critique our activist strategies and get involved in other things that will be a little bit more useful to us. So to get started, is anyone here not familiar with Food Not Bombs at all and what it does? Okay. So Food Not Bombs is an organization that was formed in the 1970s roughly around Boston by a group of anti-war, anti-nuclear activists who initially were just trying to raise money to get their friend out of jail for a protest that he had done. But basically what they do is they collect excess food from their local communities, food that's been, that is like expired from supermarket shelves but is not actually bad, it just is being thrown out based on the sort of food system we have in the US. And they take it and they prepare this food and they will serve it to people in a public place, totally free to everybody. And they do it not as a charity, not as a way of saying like, well, you know, let's help these poor people, but saying that the socioeconomic system we have in this country is such that it produces people who are hungry and who need food. And we have all of this excess food that is being thrown away, and so why don't we make use of that to help these people and to help ourselves as well. The people who do this a lot of times don't have a lot of economic security as well, so let's do this together. And it's based on a principle of what they call direct action, completely nonviolent. So this was formed and it was combined with a lot of street theater and things like that. And it was initially just 8 people and their 4 dogs. It was a few people and their 4 dogs. And it has grown so that now it has over 400 local chapters all over the world. And it has become a real kind of phenomenon and has impacted a lot of major social actions and tears in the kind of capitalist fabric that we've seen. They've played a role. And my own interest in Food Not Bombs came from participating in Food Not Bombs in Norfolk and having a lot of friends who do it and looking at the way it operates. And that got me really interested in the organization as a type of practice. And so now I'm kind of approaching it from a slightly different angle than I did in the book, which was more looking at it as specifically a form of animal liberation activism. And so here I kind of take it as a given that it is a form of animal liberation activism, but it's also a lot of other things at the same time. And this is kind of this slogan is kind of what the group operates under, is that we have all this money to be building these B-1 bombers that are devastating countries and devastating people all over the world, and yet somehow we don't have money for education, we don't have money for housing, we don't have money for food. So even though I think that Food Not Bombs does a lot, it allows a lot of different kinds of people to get involved, which is, I think, one of the main benefits of it. It has these sort of 3 anchor points that have been reaffirmed by its members repeatedly. So in order to be a Food Not Bombs, basically 3 things. All the food has to be vegan. We don't have any leaders. We use a consensus process. And Food Not Bombs is dedicated to nonviolent direct action. So for all the different variants that different groups of people will, all the different variants that a different Food Not Bombs chapters will have, these are the 3 anchor points that have to remain. So why is Food Not Bombs an intersectional movement as opposed to certain other things? Well, it does a lot of different kinds of work at the same time. It approaches and highlights a lot of different forms of injustice, even though it doesn't necessarily mark them. The practices that they do kind of force you to be looking at all these different kinds of inequality and socio-political issues that are existent in the world we live in. And what that does is it allows a lot of people of very different persuasions to kind of see, different people will see different problems when they look at a Food Not Bombs action, in the sense of they're going to see like what kind of need is being met through this action. And it allows them to kind of approach that and become in solidarity with it and help it out on their own terms, rather than having to stick to something that might foreground rhetoric or ideology, which precludes anyone who might agree with the action but disagree with the motivations for it. So just to give you an idea here, I put up some things that the action of Food Not Bombs highlights. So we have, it's highlighting income inequality, it's nutrition deficiencies, it makes the homeless visible if homeless people are coming to a public place to receive food. It makes them visible to the community where they're often rendered invisible either through less forceful forms, or in the case of San Francisco and some other places, they're rendered invisible through coercion, actually physically moving them out of areas. And then I actually had food politics divided into several different categories because I know that our jumping off point for this is kind of animal rights. Because, so I mean with food politics, I mean if you're feeding somebody a vegetarian or a vegan meal, that automatically starts getting people thinking about like, okay, what is this food? Where is it coming from? Why is it vegetarian? And there's a lot of practical reasons for that. I mean, vegetarian, vegan food is going to keep longer than meat will. It's easier to prepare. But there's also some very serious ideological reasons that the initial founders of Food Not Bombs were very conscious about. I spoke to Keith McHenry, who was one of the co-founders, and he's kind of the oral historian, sort of, or the historian of Food Not Bombs now. And it was a very conscious decision, he said, between all the people who initially made Food Not Bombs, that this has to be a vegetarian event. They said they were all vegan, actually, when they started it, but vegan wasn't really a word they knew. But it just seemed apparent to them that if we're going to be against violence, we have to be against violence for everyone, and animals are part of that paradigm. So what is different about Food Not Bombs as an action, as opposed to some of the other things we do, like protests and things of that nature? Well, it separates rhetoric from action, for one thing. And I think that's a really important thing to just keep in mind, because a lot of the forms of activism that we engage in is basically highlighting rhetoric or using whatever we do for the purposes of getting our message out there. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly legitimate form of activism. But it's one way to go about things that's going to produce particular effects. And what I find interesting about Food Not Bombs is that if you kind of reverse it, you can do something a little bit differently. So what Food Not Bombs does is they go out and they have an action where they feed people. Okay, well, but they don't necessarily brand exactly why they're feeding people. They don't talk. The main purpose of Food Not Bombs is not to get in front of a camera and tell people about the ills of capitalism or how social policy is oppressing a certain segment of society, and racism and these other things. So what that does is that opens a space for people to kind of read into it what they want to read into it. And it's based in an idea that is a very, it's an idea that a lot of people can get behind, right? Like, these people are hungry, they should be fed. I mean, it's, even in the neoliberal age we live in of, people need to buy something and we need to vote with our dollars and everything's based around money. Everyone still pretty much agrees that if somebody's hungry, they should have food. We might not agree with why, but so that allows a lot of people to get involved with a low investment. So we're foregrounding this widely palatable action that's going to attract a lot of people and attract a lot of support. And this actually is really handy in very practical terms. So when Food Not Bombs was in San Francisco, they were serving food in this open park, and they were serving it without a permit. And then one day someone came by and said, you know, you guys should really have a permit. And they said, okay, well, we'll try and apply at the Park Service for a permit. And they asked some people at the parks about it, and they didn't really know or seem to care at all. And they didn't have any kind of resistance whatsoever until out of nowhere one day, 45 riot police literally ran out of the woods and beat them up and arrested all of them. And that actually, every time, I mean, Food Not Bombs members have been arrested and beaten countless times for their actions, but every time it seems to produce a massive public outcry and massive public support. So the first time they would get arrested and beaten up, Keith McHenry said all these people were suddenly calling us on the phone and saying, hey, how can I get arrested for feeding homeless people like you are? That's so cool. And these were from a wide array of groups. These were from Catholic groups, these were from trade unions, these were from teachers unions. So it allowed a lot of different people to get involved, and you don't necessarily have to be a vegan anarchist of a particular political persuasion in order to do that. But that being said, there is, as I said before, these kind of anchoring principles that are articulated in the three mandates. And furthermore, I would say that there are also other things that are not stated that ought to be. Obviously, we should have safe spaces for people of all gender identities and abilities and so on and so forth. But those things are not, they're not people's first point of access. Internalize and come to know as you become part of the organization. So it's easier to bring people in. So what does this allow us to do? Well, it allows us to bring in people from different backgrounds. My own Food Not Bombs that I was a part of had people of more socialist persuasion. We had a libertarian guy there, although he probably leaned more to the left than most libertarians do. So all these people who otherwise, and I've seen, you know, and you probably have too, intense disagreements amongst people who I would argue believe in almost all the same things. I went to a socialism conference a few years ago, and the anarchists there and the socialists were just gridlocked. They were not interested in talking. I mean, it was a very frustrated conversation, if any was there at all. And the reason is because they were just talking explicitly about ideology and about their specific beliefs. Again, nothing wrong with it. That's a good thing. We should be entering into dialogue. We should be finding the places where we have impasses and the places where we can work together. And I think that Food Not Bombs is a place where, precisely because it's not foregrounding that ideology, different groups of people can work together. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, I've highlighted here these four groups that are, you know, obviously have a pretty cogent political philosophy. But I think one of the best things that it'll do is it'll bring together people who don't necessarily have a strong identification with a particular camp. And it can get them politically involved through an action that's very accessible. So part of this, this has a lot of weight in terms of, I think, the way that you can socialize people into getting politically involved, but it also provides very important logistical support to existing social movements, which I think does produce a lot of power in itself. And the quote I have, "Get them a cup of coffee," was something from Chris Hedges when he was speaking to the Green Party once. To see it. They were asking him, how are we going to change the world given all these strong social problems? And I mean, if you've ever listened to Chris Hedges, he's got a pretty bleak outlook. But he did say one. He was like, "Look, just get these people a cup of coffee." You know, I mean, Napoleon said an army runs on his stomach. Well, so do activists. You know, if somebody's been sitting in a tree for a week, they could probably use, you know, a hot meal and a cup of coffee to keep them going. And so that's extremely important. So Food Not Bombs has participated in a lot of very important political events. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, Food Not Bombs was serving them. Anti-nuclear activists in the Southwest, Food Not Bombs was serving as these people were laying down in front of a gate to prevent a nuclear bomb from going off for a test. Striking farm workers in Sarajevo. After Hurricane Katrina hit, Food Not Bombs was actually the main source of emergency food relief because the government completely failed in its ability to provide that infrastructure. People were calling the American Red Cross saying, "Where do I get food?" And they just forwarded it to Food Not Bombs because they were the only people who were able to provide that sort of response. And also, of course, Occupy Wall Street, Food Not Bombs provided that important logistical support. I'll get to that in a second. So basically what we're doing here is let's say somebody maybe they're not really interested in veganism. They think it's this like bourgeois white person thing or something, or they don't really care for like the anarchist or the anarchist mode. Well, if they're hungry, they're going to eat your sandwich, you know. And I think there's a lot of power in that. I mean, if you can make yourself necessary, you make yourself meeting a need that people need to have met, then that kind of gets you, well, a place at the table, metaphor. You kind of have to be listened to because you bring something to the table, something very tangible, right? So when we're dealing with these wider movements, that's a way that we can kind of get our own points of view in the door because we do have an important role. And this has a precedent. So the Black Panther Party, much maligned in the media as being very focused on weapons and guns and all these things, actually provided a lot of very important community programs to serve their communities that gained them a lot of popular support. The most famous one being the Breakfast for Children program, which served free food to children who would otherwise go to school hungry. So the Black Panther Party recognized that a lot of the black youth in their communities would go to school and they would have to be sent home because they would pass out, because they wouldn't have any food to eat, and obviously this would severely inhibit learning. And so they saw this as a way to make a real tangible impact in their community. It wasn't vegan, but yeah, oh well. And this is just one of many services that they provided their communities. And this is something that predates Food Not Bombs by at least 10 years. I just lost my train of thought. And it's important, I think, to also recognize that Black Panther initiatives were not prefigurative politics. They weren't saying this is the world we want to live in. They're saying this is a survival mechanism because we need to produce, we need to meet certain basic needs in order to get people to the point that they can become politically active. Because if you need to get food, that is very understandably like the priority that you're going to have. So just to kind of highlight some of the other things, Food Not Bombs itself is it's focused on feeding people who are hungry, right? But they also, the Food Not Bombs action actually came out of a group of activists who were very focused on street theater as a way of making awareness. So one thing they did is there was a group that had, Pepsi was having the Pepsi Challenge, and I think it was like Harvard Square somewhere, and asking people to like blindfold them and say, you know, is this Coke or Pepsi? Can you tell the difference? And so they had this thing called the Tofu Smoothie Challenge, and they said, hey, you should try this tofu smoothie. It's got more nutrition in it than all the Pepsi in the world. And then they were using that to hand out pamphlets talking about like Coca-Cola bottling plants and how people who tried to organize unions were being killed. Pepsi didn't seem to like that, even though it was against their competitor. And then in Croatia, the Croatian Food Not Bombs actually took a freshly killed cow head in front of the McDonald's and to show people where their food was coming from, and it had a big sign that said McDonald's eat shit in Croatia. And then when Czechoslovakia broke up, the Food Not Bombs chapter actually created the whole animal shelter system in this new country. And then while bombs were being dropped, people were serving food in Serbia. They actually, where they were serving food in this one building, Keith McHenry was there visiting and helping them serve, and he said, well, where's the bathroom? And they said, well, that side of the building got blown up and it's a crater, so we all just go in there now. So Food Not Bombs is all over. There's in the Philippines, they're in Africa, they're everywhere. They're doing all sorts of different things. So this is a way for, obviously, us to get together. We can get people to think about animal rights, get to think about the food they eat, but think about it in a way that shows, by virtue of this action, that the issues that we're concerned about with animals are inextricably tied to all of these other issues having to do with capitalism, poverty, the military, etc. So I think that what we can take away from this is let's think about maybe some other, and I don't have specific ideas, but what are some other action-centered forms of activism that we can engage in order to bring in a wider audience and have that produce a community that then is held together by those actions and will sustain some heated conversations between people of different political persuasions to kind of help build alliances and also meet very important concrete needs in our communities. So if anyone wants to get involved in Food Not Bombs, you can go to foodnotbombs.net. Also, Food Not Bombs Houston here has a very active chapter, so I encourage you to get involved. If you have any questions, definitely ask me. Thank you very much.
So I think we're now going to move on to Angelique Rivard, who is virtually with us, at least in her physical form. But in her cerebral and vocal form, it's going to be fully with us in just 1 second as soon as we get all the electrons in place. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Can you all hear that in the back? Okay.
Should we turn the computer around so you can hear a little bit better? That might help. And then turn it up all the way. So let me introduce Angelique Rivard. She is at Pace Law School, and she serves as president of the school's Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she advocates for wildlife. Angelique is a research assistant to David Casuto, where she co-wrote a resolution for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, addressing the impacts of confined animal feeding operations on climate change, so the effect that those have on climate change. She has interned at the Animal Cruelty Unit of Westchester County DA's office with the Humane Society of the United States and Equal Justice Alliance. So prior to law school, Angelique received her master's in ethics and society from Fordham University, where she was editing assistant and co-presented on the topic of Peter Singer and Christian ethics at Oxford University. Welcome, Angelique.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I also wanted to thank Joe and everyone at the Institute for Critical Animal Studies for allowing me this wonderful opportunity to share my path and research with you from afar, and also to learn from the other panelists and all of you as well. So I'm delighted to be speaking with you. So I thought for today I'd talk briefly about my journey to studying animal ethics and to law school, which really demonstrates the interplay between activism and the law. Then I'd like to talk about some of the legal hurdles for advocating for animals, those both in the criminal and the civil context, and next offer some solutions and how activists can use the legal and political system to help animals, specifically describing North Carolina's 19A statute, which I first learned about at the Animal Law Conference back in October at Stanford Law School. Then I'll sort of conclude by suggesting what I believe to be one of the most effective ways to help animals, which is actually changing the law through policy efforts. So after being an animal lover for my entire childhood, when I reached college, I became vegetarian and I began learning about the various issues in society regarding non-human animals. So in the summer of 2009, I approached Odessa's Alliance and I asked if I could help her with the repealing of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, also known as ADA, which was about right after the whole Shack 7 case. Just a brief synopsis for anyone who doesn't really know about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. It labels individuals who protest or even discuss protesting, such as creating a website, of industries that use animals as terrorists. So in the Shack 7 case, 6 individuals were arrested for having a website showing the truth behind a laboratory that did very cruel animal testing, and they were charged with violating ADA, which has extremely harsh penalties, including decades of imprisonment. So, as you might expect, many constitutional issues like freedom of speech were challenged, but ADA's main goal is to effectively chill speech on animal activists, so that's the whole point. Anyways, currently ADA is being examined and hopefully amended in Congress, but the case was really pivotal for me because it exposed me to this whole new world of animal activism and how the law can seriously hurt or help activists. So after that exposure, I decided to get my master's where I'd be able to research and learn more about animal ethics, and then went on to law school where I am now. So since being in law school, I learned that there are a lot of problems with the law, especially for animal advocates. Going back to ADA briefly, more recently there was a 2011 case, another case challenging ADA, and ultimately the First Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the dismissal of the plaintiff's or the activist's case based on lack of standing. So that really brings me to the first and really the only problem that I'll discuss right now today. It's the biggest problem for not only animal activists, but also for environmentalists, which is bringing forth their claims standing. So to bring forth your claim, you need to prove injury or harm. I'm just going to go through a little legalese, so bear with me. So I'll just explain it a little bit further, but there are three main requirements that must be met in order for a litigant to achieve standing. First, the litigant. Hello?
Yeah, we're here.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, I heard a noise. Okay. So first, the litigant must prove injury in fact. While academics have struggled to understand exactly what that means, it is most commonly interpreted to be actual or imminent injury that is constitutionally cognizable. The injury may constitute economic, aesthetic, conservational, physical, or recreational interest that it can be harmed. The injury cannot, though, be abstract or emotional. And the litigant claiming the injury must be distinct from the injury imposed upon the public at large. So that's injury in fact. Secondly and thirdly, the injury must be caused by the actions of the defendant, and the injuries must be redressable by a favorable ruling of the court. So you need causation and a remedy. So standing is particularly problematic in the animal context, since animals cannot meet the requirements of standing under the law themselves, although we have been trying. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the SeaWorld case with Tofu and Lolita. PETA and ALDF have been trying to demonstrate standing on behalf of the orcas, but it's a very difficult standard to meet, so the animals really rely on human beings, us, to bring suit on their behalf when they're being harmed. In addition to traditional standing, there are two other forms of standing which are applicable in animal cases. One which makes acquiring standing more difficult for animal advocates, and one which makes it less difficult. Regarding the first, courts have discretionary authority to include a fourth standing requirement called prudential standing. In addition to the three requirements to traditional standing, prudential standing requires that the litigant have an injury falling within the zone of interest intended to be protected under that applicable statute. This fourth requirement creates another and perhaps the most difficult hurdle for animal advocates wishing to obtain standing in cruelty cases. The other type of standing, called organizational or representational standing, allows animal welfare organizations such as the Animal Legal Defense Fund, the Humane Society of the United States, and others to sue on behalf of their members. This type of standing is very advantageous to animal advocates since it typically is easier for an entire organization with funds allocated specifically for litigation to bring suit as opposed to individual members like you and I. So the three requirements of organizational standing are: one, individual members of the organization must be able to sue on their own right. Two, the organization's interests in the suit are germane to the organization's overall purpose or mission. And three, the claims or remedies do not require participation of the individual members. Okay, so that's the legalese I wanted to get through. So now that I've talked a bit about how the law makes our jobs really difficult, I wanted to talk about some new discoveries that work and make it a little easier for lawyers and non-lawyer advocates to really advocate for animals. So one method for subverting some of the hurdles embedded in the requirements of standing, and also to ensure a greater likelihood of success, is to utilize private rights of action, or citizen suits. While private rights of action still require the basic three requirements of standing to be met, they do not require prudential standing, making it slightly easier to obtain standing. Private rights of action are one of the most powerful legal mechanisms that advocates, both lawyers and non-lawyers alike, can utilize to impart change and advance animal welfare. As a legislatively created provision, private rights of action allows citizens to bring suit against either violators of the law, so long as the citizen can prove that they had been injured by that violation, or the government entities who fail to enforce the law, so long as the party bringing the suit can prove that they were injured by the lack of enforcement. Ultimately, when a statute incorporates a private right of action provision, it allows citizens to act as civil prosecutors on behalf of the country or state. So why would we want to use civil litigation over criminal prosecution? Well, civil enforcement of animal crimes may have a better chance of success over criminal enforcement for the following reasons. Since the consequences to civil liability are often less severe than criminal guilt, the standards of proof are different. Guilt in a criminal case must be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, while in a civil case, liability must only be proved by a preponderance of the evidence. Additionally, under the criminal procedure, defendants are allotted constitutionally acquired due process rights, which are not required in civil suits, such as the right to a jury trial, the right to court-appointed counsel, and the exclusionary rule application are not applicable in civil suits. And also, civil suits are much more, they're quicker. They tend to be a lot faster. So if anyone has any questions about any specifics within that, feel free to ask me during the Q&A. Since the welfare of a certain animal or group of animals is often the main priority of a citizen or organization bringing suit, animals benefit from a legal system that focuses predominantly on their care. One of the major differences between criminal and civil law is that criminal law seeks to punish the offender, while civil law seeks to reward or remedy the plaintiff. While the penalties, again, under civil suits are not as harsh to the defendant as they would be in the criminal prosecution, the animal at issue is more likely to be rescued and taken care of in a civil suit. So now I'm going to talk about 19A, North Carolina statute. One of the most successful animal protection statutes that include a private right of action is North Carolina's 19A, which is specifically tailored for animal cruelty purposes. The statute provides a private right of action to anyone who has an interest against some harm committed to an animal. This wide scope of the statute does not limit plaintiff status to persons who own or possess the animal. In fact, the statute is inclusive in other important areas as well. So for instance, the term animal is defined as every living vertebrate with certain classifications except human beings. It also defines cruelty as every act, omission, or neglect whereby unjustifiable physical pain, suffering, or death is caused or permitted. Furthermore, this statute goes on to allow opportunities for both temporary and permanent injunctions. This is relief in which the plaintiff gets to have suitable care taken for the animal, as well as ordering the defendant to pay the plaintiff, most often a local shelter organization that has now taken in the animal. The defendant has to pay for the cost of food, water, shelter, and care, including medical care, during the interim when the trial is going on. So that's the temporary injunctive relief. Until the trial is settled, yeah. It even provides for an opportunity to enjoin the defendant from acquiring new or future animals. So that's the best preventative measure that it has. A lot of it is remedial, but that is preventative. While this statute does permit a wide range of plaintiffs to bring forth a lawsuit against a wide range of acts done to a wide range of animals, of course there are some exemptions. The exemptions in 19A are not unusual. They are the same type of exemptions that are excluded from most animal cruelty statutes. The North Carolina statute excludes animals used in biomedical research, for agricultural production, and in lawful sporting activities. Several components of the North Carolina statute have been challenged, but on more than one occasion, the North Carolina Court of Appeals has upheld the animal-friendly law as valid. The broad classification of a proper plaintiff under the statute was originally challenged, but held as valid in Justice for Animals v. Robeson, and then again was challenged, and also the challenge of animal welfare organizations as plaintiffs, but again upheld as valid in ALDF v. Woodley, and that was in 2007. So the North Carolina Court of Appeals has also said that a proper defendant includes corporations as well as sue a single actor who has a backyard slaughter under these statutes. Clearly, this is a model piece of legislation. The North Carolina 19A statute enables citizens to specifically address animal cruelty concerns within the bounds of the legal system. While no other state has yet enacted a statute exactly like North Carolina's statutes that can be utilized for similar purposes. A number of states have enacted nuisance abatement laws, which enjoin the defendant from continuing harm to the animal or animals. These state laws explicitly provide for a private right of action within their nuisance abatement statutes, typically combining more than one statute. So for instance, Arizona's statute explicitly states that criminal activity causing the nuisance shall be enjoined, abated, and prevented. Since animal cruelty is a crime in Arizona, it can be abated. Furthermore, the statute indicates that any resident of the county or city who is affected by the nuisance may bring an action. So there's your private right of action, allowing local residents to bring suit for animal cruelty. The Michigan legislature has specifically addressed a narrow form of animal cruelty as applying to its private right of action provision in its nuisance statute. For instance, the Michigan nuisance statute combined with its action to abate statute explicitly allows individual citizens to bring civil suits for animal fighting and animal shooting in particular. So what are the pitfalls? While the North Carolina statute is a quintessential animal protection statute, or the best we can have so far, other states should try to adopt similar ones, and there are some potential pitfalls for this type of statute. First off, while statutes like 19A are excellent for caring for abused animals in the aftermath, preventing animal abuse is obviously a high priority. Monetary penalties and injunctions available from statutes like 19A are important, but again, the welfare of the individual animal is a concern, and they do less compared to criminal penalties for discouraging cruelty in the long term. While the harmed animal in the case of bar will be taken care of under 19A, many other animals suffering similar abuse will most likely be unaffected as a result of the case of bar. So the deterrence factor for committing future crimes is less so in civil cases. The threat of imprisonment, as opposed to monetary penalties, may have a long-term effect at combating cruelty. However, it is arguable that animal crimes should be handled on a case-by-case basis, at least for now, and that if civil suits are the most effective and the fastest way to get there, then we should most certainly use them. So, thank you. Perfect timing. Okay. So I actually was able to get a video of a particular case where the North Carolina 19A statute was utilized and was very successful. It's called, it's a PETA video, and it's about Ben the Bear. So, Drew, if you could pull that up.
I'm on it.
Thank you. It's about a 2.5-minute video.
This is Ben. For 6 long years, Ben lived, if you could call it living, in a barren cement and wire pen at a seedy roadside zoo named Jumbus Ranch. In 2012, Peter joined with local residents and the Animal Legal Defense Fund to get him out. Here is his story. Ben was deprived of even his most basic needs. His world consisted of a concrete floor, an old ball, and some stumps of wood. He was forced to drink and bathe in putrid water from a filthy metal trough, fed dry dog food dumped onto the same floor where he had to relieve himself. Ben spent his waking hours pacing, a result of profound privation and chronic distress. The concrete floor caused his paws to painfully wear down to the pink. With Peter's help, concerned citizens filed a civil cruelty to animals lawsuit against Jumbus, and the judge found that Ben's dietary, veterinary, and environmental needs were not being met. She allowed Peter to transfer Ben to a sanctuary in California. Federal Express flew Ben across the country free of charge. The flight crew dubbed the mission Bear Force One. When Ben explored his vast new spacious habitat for the first time, he pawed at the earth and sniffed the ground, and he felt grass beneath his paws, perhaps for splashing in his very own pool, ridding his body of grime for the first time in years. That night, he slept soundly on a comfortable bed of fresh hay and natural foliage. On August the 27th, 2012, the court ruled in Ben's favor, and the sanctuary is now his permanent home. For the very first time, Ben finally gets to be a bear.
So that was a great example of how 19A was really successful, and we're hoping that more states implement the same type of statutes. The judge there ordered initially a temporary injunction, and then that became permanent. And just the fact that the citizens were able to bring suit in general was in large part because of 19A. So just to conclude, my path to law school and researching animal ethics and practicing animal law, I think truly demonstrates our need from all disciplines to achieve the common goal of increasing the welfare and protection of animals. I'd like to also just mention that political measures are particularly helpful in this area, since society's values regarding animals are generally not reflected in the law. So policy measures like ballot initiatives can be exceedingly beneficial, and I really encourage everyone to take an active role in their state legislature. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to your questions.
So our next paper is by Mike Nicholson, Understanding Oppression and Transforming Liberation. Mike Nicholson is currently completing a thesis and a Master of Arts candidate, and is a Master of Arts candidate in the program of Criminology at the University of Guelph, in Guelph, Ontario, that's in Canada. He participates in various human and non-human campaigns throughout Ontario, including a running series of conferences centered upon developing spaces that are devoted to discussion of intersectional issues for total liberation. So, Mike, looking forward to your presentation.
So, thank you for the invitation to speak. It's just loading here. So, just to briefly summarize this presentation, so the intention here is to start a more critical conversation about what justice is and what we mean when we're talking about justice. I think a lot of people in this room and at this conference are really passionate about the ideas of justice and injustice towards human and non-humans. So I think it's really crucial that we understand what we mean by when we're talking about justice, as well as the entire process for how we're going about achieving justice. So just as I begin, I think it's important just to recognize that to provide a land acknowledgement for the people of Karen Nunk, it's Kauran Kawa and Eko Kisa, so traditional caretakers of the territory before settlement and colonization. And I think land acknowledgements like this are important because we're here talking about rights, liberation, about justice, and I think we need to really be aware that this is happening on stolen lands where people have been displaced through historical and ongoing processes that have been very violent and oppressive. So just getting into it with defining justice, I think it's important to first think about the idea of harm. So when we're talking about justice, trying to recall just right now for a few seconds both the time when we have experienced harm and when we have committed harm. So just recalling something like that and thinking about how they relate and how they differ. And so with the point with that is that just again to be really mindful that we all create harm in different capacities and different degrees. And sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not. That, if we're essentially living on societies like this, we're going to be creating harm or at least be extremely complicit in different degrees. So I think that's really helpful just to remember as we're trying to talk about these issues. And I think this quote from Malcolm X summarizes this really well, is that, I'll read it off for you, "Don't be in such a hurry to condemn a person because they do not do what you do or think as you think. There was a time when you didn't know what you know today." So I think that's a really great concept just to keep mindful of. Okay, so I'll be talking about retributive justice. And just an asterisk, a lot of my research has been Canadian focused, so it's going to be from a Canadian background. So the background of retributive justice, it's very similar to the United States. So it's the law and order system, or the criminal justice system. The last presentation was touching on some elements of this. So the idea here with retributive model is that it's extremely punishment based. So when we define harm by breaking policies or laws, and when we understand harm as these crimes, we look towards the offenders of these rule breakers and punishing them accordingly. So there's a lot of emphasis on harming offenders in a way that deters others from doing these things. And so with this retributive model, we have a lot of institutions of power, like the police and the courts and the prisons. So in practice, we have a lot of punishments, essentially. That's essentially what the justice system is a lot of punishments. The Canadian Criminal Code is an extremely thick book, just listing punishments after punishments. And so with this model in practice, it really serves to uphold and perpetuate a lot of the systems of oppression that exist in society elsewhere. It's very self-serving of the status quo. And so in the results of the retributive model, both in the United States and Canada, is that we have societies now where it's really hard to get out of viewing harm as not defined by laws and policies. And as well, when we view harm, we don't put sole attention on perpetrators, offenders, as the primary person to be looking towards. As well, it's really important just to recognize how much resolutions to harm, we almost unquestionably just assume there needs to be punishment, and that's the driving route for solutions to harm. So bringing this to talking about animal liberation, animal justice, asking ourselves, is this retributive model in the United States and Canada, is that something that can help us? So with that, I think it's really important to ask ourselves, is our goal to be punishing animal abusers? And if we think so, how do we even begin to punish the system of animal abuse where it's so ingrained? How do we punish something like that? And with questions like that, we should ask, is it still harm if there's no law? So cases like testing labs where it's animal testing, there's no laws against that, but a lot of people view that as extremely harmful. As well, if there's laws, does that make it harm? Like the egg law, where there's laws now that criminalize certain behavior, but a lot of animal activists and others would say that actually we're trying to relieve harm by bringing more attention towards really disgusting, awful things. So from my research in Canadian focus, animal cruelty, just to summarize what I think it's extremely problematic and very limited version of justice. So Canadian Criminal Code, it has not been updated in over a century. 1892 was the last time. And animals, when we're talking about animal abuse, animal cruelty, animals are defined under the property clause, so they're understood as property. So beyond the ideas of willful neglect, unnecessary harm, which are really limited and vague wording, so it's very hard to convict people. The perpetrators, again, the focus is on the perpetrator, the criminals. Perpetrators are understood as property owners, so it's really hard to imagine how there's any result of justice when we have stuff like this, when we're looking at criminals or perpetrators as property owners. And it's also really important to note, too, within the Canadian Criminal Code, that punishments vary according to an animal's property value. So they call them working cattle in the code. So working cattle isn't like cows have higher penalties because their capital value is higher. And so it's just interesting to note that there's so much capitalism ingrained within this version of justice where animals of higher status are going to bring about more punishment. As well, looking at prisons, asking ourselves, prisons are really fundamental to the retributive model, and asking, do we think prisons are going to bring us liberation? So another great quote by Angela Davis, stating that jails and prisons are designed to break human beings, to convert populations into specimens in a zoo, obedient to our keepers, but dangerous to each other. And I think this is a really good quote for just paralleling the commonalities with zoos and prisons, where we're keeping different groups captive, and whatever the mainstream story is, a lot of it's really designed to just break the prisoners. Briefly just going over the prison industrial complex in Canada, so the ideas with the prisons is that we exile offenders from our societies and reintegrate them at a later date, but just remembering that we're reintegrating offenders into the same society. So the factors in society that may have contributed to the cause of the crime or whatever harm was committed, none of that really changes. It's really emphasis on the perpetrator to change and to conform to what society expects of them. And so now there's over 15,000 prisoners in Canada, which again is the highest ever, as crime rates are declining in the last 2 decades. As well, it's extremely racist institution with 75% increase in racialized peoples in the last decade. And within Canada, it's approximately 4% are Indigenous on the national population, but they comprise 25% of the prison population. So that's a really staggering statistic just to show that it's how racist and oppressive this version of justice is. So tying this into how we talk about animal liberation, just looking at how retributive mentality has trickled into how we do animal rights. I think a good case example is looking at the practice of undercover investigations. And so just a case example there is the 2012 Butterball turkey operations with Mercy for Animals, where they would go undercover and document really horrific abuse towards animals that workers were committing. In this case, Butterball was just really violent abuse of turkeys. As a result, the North Carolina officials arrested these workers, some of the workers. And so Mercy for Animals describes this as making history, getting felony convictions for these workers committing abuse towards animals. So that's something that we should be proud of. Those are the 6 workers. And so with this, I think it's really important that we're asking ourselves, is punishing low-income racialized workers as individuals, they're individual workers, is that really helping anything with the systemic exploitation of animal abuse on this farm and on a variety of other farms? As well, has anything really changed as a result? Has Butterball stopped functioning? Has other similar corporations that work like this, has anything changed in that regard? And so, again, looking at a lot of these kind of messages with animal abuse demand justice. So it's a person in handcuffs. And the idea is that we need justice for animal abusers by imprisoning them. And I think it's a really important thing to take note of, because essentially what we're saying is that we're for promoting the rights of animals, for animal liberation, which is essentially we're trying to challenge a system of domination and violence, of hierarchy, by turning to another system of domination and violence and hierarchy as a way to achieve that. And so with this picture, this is taken at Marineland, a protest for captive marine animals, stating that only guilty offenders should be in jails and not marine animals. So this picture, as well as this one, is stating that we should be testing on guilty offenders and not animals. So those 2 images, I think it's really interesting, again, to note that what they're saying here is that it's actually not the oppression that is the problem, not keeping people captive, not conducting really horrific experiments on them, it's only who is being oppressed. And so with that, it's a really dangerous mindset, because now it becomes about the worthiness of the victim, and that's very close to victim blaming, where we're saying, actually this group deserves it for these reasons, this criteria. And with that, we're not really focusing on liberating the minds of the oppressors. And with that idea, I think it's another great quote is from Nelson Mandela. After spending 27 years in prison, walking out, this is how he describes it, is that when I walked out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Okay, so after hopefully convincing you how horrible the retributive model is, introducing the idea of transformative justice. So with this, the background here is that with transformative, harm is understood as actually an opportunity to correct a lot of harmful social systems and relationships within our communities. It's a very non-dogmatic, it's very grassroots style of how they deal with harm in their communities. And so they put a big emphasis on recognizing that harm comes from deeper roots of oppression, and that includes a variety of different ways that they list here, with like racism, classism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, ageism, colonialism, imperialism, speciesism, and others. And so they put a big emphasis saying that we're not going to really fix any of these examples of crimes or harm, or however you describe that, without really addressing the underlying causes of what's happening here. And so they really point out that the retributive model perpetuates these cycles of oppression by ignoring them and by colluding with them. So in practice, what they do here is some important elements is that it's a big emphasis on healing, not just for the perpetrators or the victims, but the entire communities who are affected, as well as putting emphasis on building capacity in communities to both respond to this harm and to hold perpetrators accountable. And as well, just again, working to actually change the structural patterns of what's happening and why these incidences of harm happen the way they do. So to just get some good examples, Generation 5 is a really great organization that practices transformative justice. And so what they do is, it's a national anti-violence organization who takes on issues of ending child sexual abuse. So again, it's a really extreme issue that's it's really complicated, and they think the best way of dealing with this is actually with transformative justice. And they make really clear in a lot of their materials is that individual and collective liberation is fundamentally intertwined. So you can't have one without the other. You can't be helping victims, survivors, or perpetrators without helping everyone. Another really great organization is Philly Stands Up, who is working in Philadelphia. So it's a survivor-led collective that works with perpetrators of sexual assault. And so they use a community-based system of accountability for how to do this. And so again, it's a really great way of looking at holding perpetrators accountable while still working to change their behavior. So it's completely opposite of the retributive system of trying to just push out offenders of the communities. So again, with the results, we have harm defined by communities. It's going to be local and how we understand it. Instead of being told what the laws are and what's our priority should be, it should be up to community members in those spaces to help define that. And yeah, again, it's just really important just to note that justice is found through transformation, about recognizing that things are changing. So, applying this to transformative justice to animal liberation. So I think, when we talk about veganism, it's really important to, veganism, it functions as kind of a mentality of do no harm, where we're trying to reduce suffering in our communities. And so, while it's noting that, it's cruelty-free, like that kind of label, it's extremely simplistic and very superficial version, where not only is it trying to promote social change through consumerism by what we buy and don't buy, it's propping up one system, which is like capitalism and commodification, while trying to challenge another system of domination, like speciesism. As well, it's just really, really important to note how vegan products, it still runs on a distribution model that's really destructive towards the environment and towards our communities with worker rights and just a variety of others. but you can really note the absence of that kind of critical underlying social causes that transformative justice really takes on when we just talk about veganism on its own. As well with animal rights, it's noting how, the idea of rights is saying that we should have the liberty to not be confined, harmed, or killed, but there are so many human rights already, constituted and written down that are widely disrespected, and that once we recognize that the legal system is based on so much violence, we have to ask ourselves, is really creating more rights for more groups, is that really going to change anything for the better? And I think this quote from Patrice Jones is really a great way of talking about when we talk about animal rights, is that states as they are currently constituted are always violent. They were created by processes of violence and maintained by processes of violence. And this is also true about our systems of law. If what you mean by rights, which is legal rights, then you're talking about enforcement. Enforcement by who and how? Will we be sending people to prison? Will we be using guns to enforce animal rights? So I think it's just really important to talk about when we're talking about rights. If people disrespect them, how do we challenge that? So just going with this, just wrapping up with some ideas, is how we organize. So just noticing for events like this, who are here for these conversations and who aren't, and what are the reasons for this? Why aren't there? I know for a lot of events I go to, it's almost always completely homogenous for a lot of animal rights. And thinking about when I go to other events, I think if there's an emphasis towards making vegan food more accessible, I'm much more inclined to go to those events. So I think it's really important to carry that to say, if there were more gender-neutral washrooms or more accessible washrooms or more accommodations in those regards, there would be a lot more diversity and diversity of ideas. Organizing on stolen lands. So, within Turtle Island, this is all a product of colonization. So, as well with the land acknowledgement, it's interesting to note that Rice University, that William Rice was a slave owner, and he made fortunes by developing railways. It's really important to remember that we're trying to organize on land that really glorifies really awful behavior. And when we're talking about intersectionality, doing it in a way that it's not tokenizing, that's not just essentially catering to other groups for the sake that they'll join animal rights mentality, but actually doing it in a way that it's solidarity and active allyship. And so asking what we organize against. So I think the ideas of transformative justice really make that clear, is that we're going beyond just the symptoms of what these problems are and not challenging brand names or workers, but actually underlying causes. And what we're organizing for. So what are our goals and why are we here? I think you can never really overthink those sort of questions. I think good examples are Haudenosaunee. They talk about seven generations from our ancestors, 7 generations back, as well as seven generations for future generations. So, when they're making decisions, they're thinking about what did our ancestors, what would they want, and what would our future generations want. And Generation 5 talking about ending child sex abuse in 100 years. So it's very long-term. And again, recognizing that this is a process and not a destination. So the process is equally, if not more important than what we're going for. So where do we start? I think these are some good points to start off of, is just, again, recognizing from the beginning that we all cause harm. So we should be calling out behavior that we think is problematic and calling in people in a way that is not pushing them out of these conversations, but actually engaging with them in a way that's more constructive. Starting more dialogue about the roots of harm in a way that's, sometimes I feel like it's more important to unlearn a lot of things before we start learning things, which is a lot of just assumptions and stereotypes and privileges that we're really taught by our societies. And again, not endorsing any particular strategy, because again, transformative justice makes really clear that it's very community-based, so what works in one community is not going to work in another. And the last quote is from Octavia Butler, saying that all social change is speculative fiction, because we've never seen a world without poverty, never seen a world with total equality, never seen a world without prisons. Therefore, activism is speculative fiction. It's visionary fiction because we are writing a world where we've never seen, but a world we'd like to live in. It's hard and unapologetic, but it's hopeful because it can cause us to move, wakes us up, and shows us that change is possible. So I think it's important, just again, to remember that, you know, when we're talking about transformative justice, it can be really intimidating to think about developing a whole new system of justice. But I think that's stuff we're doing all the time when we're doing activism. It's just imagining, and it's not yet here, which is something that's can be really great if we look at it like that. And that is it. So thank you.
So I'll just say a collective thank you to all of our presenters and panelists today. I think these were really fantastic discussions and papers and very provocative in a lot of ways. And so we have some time now, about half an hour or so, to engage in conversation and ask questions, statements, reflections that you have about any and everything, connections, or if you have questions for the individual panelists, for Drew or Angelique, who's coming around the corner there, or Mike. Yes.
I have a question. This might be for all of you, but maybe mostly for Mike. I'm familiar with restorative justice, and I think I've had an easy time actually empathizing with animal abusers or those who work in slaughterhouses. But I'm wondering, like, how big does that circle expand? Like, I'm thinking about like policemen, FBI agents, people who are also in some ways victims of our system, but now have become like the oppressors. Mm-hmm. Just it's something I've been thinking about as people have asked, like, when there's opportunity for dialogue between the state, if you will, or you know whatever we want to call it, and activists, and like how dangerous that can be, or whether it's appropriate, or whether there's room for that. Like especially when you think about them as individuals versus part of the system. Have any of you dealt with that or thought about that?
I don't talk to police.